Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock-flavoured podcast. On this show, our Halloween period rampages to its conclusion as we tackle our Patron's Choice Halloween Poll champion, Guy and Smith's Sabat, the Graveyard Vultures from 1982. For this one, I roped in Phil and Graham as our regular Guy and Smith appreciators, although I don't think any of us were quite prepared for what we would find within these pages. When we talked about Slimer, Loz and I mused on the ramping up of the nature of the violent content in some of the horror books that were emerging in the late 70s and early 80s, and this book is another very good example of that escalation. So for the second episode on the bounce, I need to give a content warning for strong content, including rape and necrophilia. Beyond that, I'll just let the discussions speak for themselves. And I say discussions, plural, because after a few days Graham and I felt the need to come together again and ruminate further on the Sabat series, so there is something of an addendum at the latter stages of this episode. So, gird your loins and prepare to be as baffled as we were as we dig into Sabat, the Graveyard Vultures. We're back in Derry and Tom's for the 2024 Halloween special. Welcome back, Graham. Graham's back, first time since, well, we only did Pisces Rising 5 minutes ago, didn't we? But welcome back, Graham.
Brilliant. Yeah, it wasn't that long, was it? Was it a couple of weeks ago? 3 weeks ago. Can't remember.
Yeah, not long ago at all. So, I neglected to ask last time, but what has been going on in Grahamsville?
Yes, I've been busy with family life, but I've also decided to take on ridiculous projects. One of them was started a year ago, actually, which is the novel. After reading Guy and Smith's How to Write Horror Fiction, I thought I'd attempt to write horror fiction and try and write a one-shit book. And, that's the go. I've got 30,000 words, I think, so far. And Andy, you've been part of it, haven't you? Writing one of the vignettes.
Yes, and I was absolutely delighted to be asked. It was super exciting and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I can't wait for it to come out in print so I can buy it. Looking forward to it. Yeah. When are you intending to get it out?
I'm looking beginning next year, I think, 2025, and it's called The Woodlice.
Nice!
So you can imagine what
critter action.
Exactly. You can imagine by the title what it will be like. And it's set in a Sussex village and woodlands and woodlice in sort of mid-80s.
Yeah. Well, I'll look out for further news of that, and of course we'll be putting the word out the moment that is available. And I'll probably buy multiple copies so I can send some to patrons as special giveaways. And then when the time comes, we could maybe even get together and do a reading. That'd be exciting, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely aiming for the one shit book market. That's the aim.
That's the best market, isn't it? Yeah. So. Funnily enough, our good pal Firthy made a suggestion not so long ago that there should be a story, a Thread spin-off novel with the build-up to the Third World War starting with conflict in Iran, and it should feature Lewis Collins' SAS character Captain Skellen from the Who Dares Wins film. So I said, oh my God, I would read that. And he said, you should write it. So straight away we started having a conversation, right? Who owns the rights to the character of Skellen from Who Dares Wins? And Firthy, bless him, he said, well, I've got a $5,000 credit card limit. I'll try and buy him.
Can't be more than $5,000, can it, surely?
Yeah, well, I tell you what, if you could get hold of the rights to the Skellen character and do a series of one-shit book Skellen knockoffs, I can't believe it didn't happen already. When you look at the market for essentially one-shit book like SAS Crime Crime Commandos, Peter Cave, why didn't Peter Cave, number one, write the novelisation of Who Dares Wins? Is there a novelisation of Who Dares Wins out there? We're now going to have to find out. And two, why wasn't there a series of spin-off novels about the Lewis Collins Skellen character? That seems like a massive hole in the market.
Certainly does.
You've got a million spin-off Man with No Name novels. So if you like Fistful of Dollars and A Few Dollars More and The Good, Bad and the Ugly, there's about a dozen of those, as we found out last year when we were chatting about various things. So all these things are out there. But anyway, we're already off down a rabbit hole, aren't we? The Peter Cave rabbit hole. We haven't even got to. Oh, and thank you for my Flood Fire book
it came
by Peter Cave. Came today, yeah.
Yeah, it
so
looks
that
good.
Peter
Looks
Cave
interesting.
rabbit hole continues to beckon, doesn't it?
Yeah, looks an interesting one, that one.
It does. It looks really exciting. But I've got to say, I've got my eye on Truck. I think Truck looks amazing.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Phil. It's also welcome back to Phil.
Thank you. I didn't realise just how long it had been.
Last Halloween. You haven't been on for a year.
I can't get in.
Can't get in.
You're too popular.
Yeah, my backside. I can't get you to do your bloody homework. That's what it is. You were supposed to be on the Pisces Rising episode, but you didn't do your homework.
You didn't give me enough time.
I don't know about that. Well, I've just seen that Graham has cracked a can. Graham, what is your Halloween tipple?
It's I've got 2 drinks here, but this one's Burning Sky Arise. They're a Sussex brewery. Very nice. And I've got...
that sounds good.
Next one, Ghost Ship.
Oh, Adnams.
Adnams, yeah.
Yeah. A fine selection. And Ghost Ship, Halloween, good theme. Yeah. Phil, what are you drinking? Are you drinking spooky wine?
I am. A nice red wine.
Mm-hmm. What is it?
A Primavita. No, Primitivo.
And that's all you get.
And that's all you get.
It's wine, it's red, it's Vino Tinto.
And it's from Italy.
It's from Italy. All right, fair play. Well, I thought long and hard about what my Halloween-themed beer could be, and I tried to think of something that was appropriate. I thought, should I have sacrament wine? Well, you don't get sacrament wine, do you? And it's probably just bloody Ribena anyway. And then I thought, you know what, when I got to the end of the book, I thought, actually, the hero of this book really is West Indian. So I thought, what have I got in the cupboard? Well, the closest thing I could find to something handily West Indian was I found a bottle of Bacardi limited edition raspberry. So I'm going to spend the evening drinking Bacardi and Old Jamaica ginger beer. So that's my tipple for the evening, because I refuse to accept Sabat as a hero. This is an early spoiler, but I refuse to even acknowledge Sabat, our protagonist, as a hero. The hero of this is introduced fleetingly about 2/3 of the way through the book and then turns up at the end and saves the day. But we'll get to these details. What a book we have just read. What a fucking book. Frankly, I was not prepared. Although, when Phil was reading it in bed next to me, Phil said at one point, you know, I'm really enjoying this. This is like a lot of the books I would read, you know, like a priest solving crimes, bit of supernatural stuff, really good. And then the following night she went, ugh, I'm going to finish this because I said I'd do it for the podcast. But if we weren't podcasting about this, I would never finish this. So that's a bit of a spoiler.
To be fair, the back page had me hooked. It did. But it just went downhill from there.
Yeah. Let's see. What does the back page say? It says, Mark Sabat, ex-priest, SAS-trained killer, exorcist, is a man with a dreadful mission. Driven and haunted, he has to seek out and destroy his mortal enemy, an enemy who has chosen the left-hand path, who embodies the eternal principle of evil, an enemy who is his own brother. Well, that's not entirely true, anyway, as we find out pretty quickly. I mean, his brother's in it. Quentin. Oh, evil name. Sabat was trapped, helplessly trapped in his own paralysed body, his mind conscious but impotent, raged and struggled against the inert flesh. He could sense, feel the dark encrusted blood that masked his face, sticky and rancid. More blood had soaked into his clothing, saturated through to the skin. Beside him the girl was naked, her pale body hideously marked by the knife that had stabbed and sliced through her flesh. Above them loomed the desecrated altar, black-candled, the crucifix reversed, but now the waiting was almost over. The ceremony was about to begin. That also is not entirely accurate of what happens. This reads like a canon. You remember when Canon Films in the 80s would come up with a poster and like a couple of paragraph elevator pitch, and the film would either not get made at all, or if it did get made, it wouldn't feature any of the stars who were on the poster and would bear very little resemblance to what was in the elevator pitch. Bit of that going on here. But Graham, to someone who's never read any Guy and Smith, or someone entirely unprepared for Sabat, with no spoilers, what the fuck is this book?
It's quite different to a lot of his other books. Although I read The Woods recently, and that's akin to this. It's pretty horrific at points. But this, I don't know. The main character is awful, isn't he? Absolutely awful.
Yeah.
Yes, he is.
I think when we tried take one, just for everybody's benefit, we tried recording this last night, but we had serious Wi-Fi problems, so everything went slightly wrong. But I think last night you referred to him as a hardcore wanker, which is a literal fact, as we will find out as we get through this book. Yeah, it's an interesting one, and whereas I think the Crabs novels we've always found, even though they have the moments, they are amusing, quaint. You can read them with your tongue in your cheek, but you can also read them, enjoy them as what they are, which is 70s killer critter novels that do a non-stop tour around all of our favourite holiday haunts around the UK. This, on the other hand, somewhat different. So what year was this published? So this is Guy and Smith, and by this time, this is 1982. So Guy's been knocking books out for the best part of a decade, knocking them out fast as well. And this ends up being the first of a short series of Sabat novels about this character. I love the cover. You got a guy with an excellent tash, and below, crouching in a pentagram, being kind of menaced by a couple of winged ghostly skeletons, this naked bloke. The only naked bloke in a pentagram in this entire book is Sabat, who we find later on gets in a pentagram every night and wanks himself to sleep. So yeah, Sabat is on this cover twice. Okay, I think we're going to have to get down into it, aren't we? And we do find out, with no messing about, quite quickly what makes Sabat tick. The prologue says, Sabat had smelled evil in the air for the past hour, a cloying cold mustiness that was stronger than the scent of the pine trees and belied the balmy late spring atmosphere. The silence, too, was noticeable. The absence of birdsong and the soughing of the mountain breeze seemed to have lapsed into a calm where not even a leaf rustled, as though the world held its breath and waited. The tall man in the dark, travel-stained and crumpled suit shrugged off the uneasiness he felt with a deliberate effort, paused on the long, steep forest path to wipe the sweat from his high brow and aquiline features. He's a Guy and Smith character, so of course he has aquiline features, and we'll find out shortly, also smokes a pipe. A dry tongue flicked the fringes of his jet-black moustache, and his narrow, deep sunken eyes stared ahead into the shadow of a gathering dusk. But nothing moved. A 3-inch scar down his left cheek, a 10-year-old disfigurement, was whiter than his own sallow complexion. Tall and lithe, it was difficult to determine the age of this forest traveller. He might have been as old as 50. On the other hand, he might have been as young as 35. Agile in every movement, yet those narrowed eyes reflected a maturity, even a hint of fear, because for Mark Sabat this was the end of a long trail, one that had stretched across 3 continents where death had lurked in town and forest alike, but always his quarry had eluded him. Until now. This time there could be no escape for Quentin Sabat, his elder brother. So, we're kicking off. He's astrally projected into the body of a kestrel and flying above a forest to spy on his brother, Quentin, who's described as a villainous and cadaverous mess. A revolting Methuselah wants to be the embodiment of Satan's will on Earth. I suppose you've got to have goals, haven't you? And he's living in a shack in the forest. So as Mark Sabat returns to his true body back inside a chalk pentagram, no wanking at this point, that's to come, we found out a bit more about his past and credentials. So, let's have a listen to this. Fleeting memories came to plague Mark Sabat like a drowning man experiencing flashbacks of his life. An upper-class upbringing, his future ensured by a legacy from wealthy parents, boyhood rebellion against this planned life, and in a moment of weakness, a pleasurable teenage homosexual experience, which had driven him into the priesthood in hope of cleansing his tortured mind. Then, the discovery of his own powers, the realisation that night when he had exorcised the poltergeist, followed by the doubting of his own faith, brought about by the hypocrisy of church leaders, precipitated into yet another phase, army life that found him in the SAS, and the sheer pleasure derived from killing an enemy. Legitimate murder, not once but many times. A new Sabat, so ruthless and yet still in possession of those inexplicable powers. Powers that had saved his life on many occasions, until a dishonourable discharge had tumbled him back into civilian life. Embittered, all that mattered now was the destruction of Quentin, because no one such as he had any right to exist amidst mankind. Oh,
bloody Quentin.
Quite a bit to process there.
Do you not find it really strange? He went into the priesthood and then became SAS, and he got dishonourably discharged. He doesn't have a lot of bonus points, does he?
As we go along, we'll find out that there are probably very, very powerful reasons why he might get discharged from the army. I think at one point further on in the book, he is essentially bragging through the narrative about how he took great pleasure in torturing and killing prisoners who did not deserve to live. So yeah, it's a bit of a rummun. So we've got this initial setup where he had a homosexual experience as a teenager, joined the priesthood to try and cleanse himself of it, found the priesthood to be massively hypocritical, so probably some underlying stab at the clergy there for reasons, and then leaves, joins the SAS, becomes a killer, is too much of a killer and too rough and hard and nasty for even the SAS, and gets booted out, and now here he is, astrally projecting, trying to find his brother, who's the wrong un. so he can sort his brother Quentin out. So this is quite an interesting setup for a protagonist, isn't it? When I first started reading this, I didn't quite pick up on a lot of it.
It's an interesting start. What I found a little bit confusing, there wasn't enough of the backstory with Quentin and him. So I got quite confused about really why was there this conflict going on between them whilst I was reading this. I just didn't quite grasp that.
Yeah, we don't find anything out about Quentin, really.
I hoped it was going to come later on, but it became a thing that just came up for a few seconds here and there, didn't it?
All we know about Quentin is that he's a wrong un because he's told us he's a wrong un. He's a wrong un because he wants to be the embodiment of Satan on Earth. All right, fair enough. That does sound vaguely dodgy. He's been murderising peasants and turning them into effigies and stuff. Long story short, they have a scrap, fall into a grave, and after a struggle, Mark Sabat pops him with a few bullets from his 38, the last one in the skull, and we get a very characteristically Guy and Smith description where it says, somehow Mark Sabat managed to extricate himself from those death clutches, vomiting as he did so and trying not to breathe in the foul stench of putrefaction and death. Dimly, he was aware that he still held the revolver, and this time there was a deliberation in the way he brought the barrel to bear on his brother's forehead, almost a regret in the way he applied pressure to the hair trigger like a grieving jockey, about to dispatch his favourite but wounded mount. Because, of course, that's what jockeys do, isn't it? The report was deafening in the confined space, the stab of flame lighting up the scene vividly and implanting it indelibly on Sabat's brain. In that terrible lingering second, he saw the other man's skull split like a cracked egg, grey yolks showering up the earthy walls and stringing back in tentacles which adhered to his clothing. One last curse from that cavity of a mouth before it was swamped by a tidal wave of crimson fluid. Sabat pulled the trigger again, but the hammer fell on an empty shell. He scrambled up, felt his feet squelching on the soft body beneath him, somehow secured a grip on the top of the grave and pulled himself up amid an avalanche of soil and stones. Then he lay there on the ground, gulping in great lungfuls of freezing air and trying not to look at the three puppet-like corpses who sat closely by as though watching him, their expressions seeming to have changed to one of pleading, a mute request to be returned to their graves, and Sabat knew he would have to rebury them. Nice. Yeah. Even though the back of the book claims that this is all about a battle against his brother Quentin, he does away with Quentin in the first 6 pages. But there's a complication, because Quentin's soul survives and hitches a ride in Mark Sabat's brain. Oh, okay. A fairly interesting setup. Is it followed through on?
No.
Not really.
Not really, is it?
Not properly.
Just from time to time, like, he'll hear Quentin going, ha 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 ha. or something. And at one point he has a bit of a mental battle with him in a car and wins and falls asleep.
Yeah.
That's about the extent of it.
Yeah, he has a bit of a battle at his house in London, doesn't he, as well? A mental battle, gets tired.
Yeah, is that before or after he wanks in the pentagram?
I think possibly before, I can't remember. But there could have been more there, couldn't there? A lot more to that psychic brain wrong.
Yeah, we don't get a whole lot of it. But as the book kicks off in earnest, we do get a smorgasbord of Guy and Smith action in the first chapter. First, a scene of necrophilia and death by sex summoning in a graveyard with a bunch of sad, sleazy cultists some of whom may have bitten off more than they could chew, looking at you, Sheila, and they're led by a necromancer called Horace.
Just before you go on, there was also some raping with that necrophilia.
The first, but certainly not the last. How terrible, then, that these villains are engaged in sexual deviancy. Oh, fortunately, we've got a hero to sort all of this out.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Poor Sheila is part of this, sex Satan coven. Thought she was just in for a Commoner Gardener Satanist midnight graveyard orgy. But no, it's all a bit terrible because they dig up some bones of whom we will talk about shortly, because you looked him up, didn't you, Graham? We'll get to him.
I did.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, to cut a long story short, what does happen? She's not really into it, so she gets raped and murdered by the coven and by Horace. And then they dig up some bones, and there's a big ritual, and some weird hoof goat thing turns up and stamps all over the place, including all over her head, and smashes her head in.
But there's also the 18-year-old who was the virgin who had killed. And
the sacrifice of virgin as well.
Yeah. Satan has his way, doesn't he, with her as well.
It's an offering to the goat-hoofed one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the left-hand path, not very nice people, straight off the bat. So that's good. We've had established peril and threat and a Satanist plot. They've dug up these bones. Now, these bones, Graham, who was William Gardner?
Well, I don't... Yeah, there's someone... I looked up William Gardner. He turns out to be an English composer who wrote hymns. So I'm imagining Guy just took that name, William Gardner. Doesn't really... I couldn't find any reference to him being some sort of Satanist or anything like that. But interestingly, on Wikipedia, there's an entrance about William Gardner, and he was a vegetarian. And there's this bit where it says, Gardner was a teetotaler and vegetarian. He lived on milk and vegetable diet for several years, but gave it up after a life-changing experience. Gardner stated that on one occasion he was dining with a Mr. Brooke, an eccentric who placed a beefsteak on the table. He was offended that Gardner refused to eat the meat. Mr. Brooke put a horse pistol to Gardner's head and declared he would shoot him if he did not eat the beefsteak. After the experience, Gardner gave up his vegetarian diet and resumed his former mode of living. So there you go.
Wow.
Oh, what an experience. This William Gardner, all we know, it may or may not be the same William Gardner if the actual William Gardner ended up getting up to no good. But this William Gardner, whose bones they dig up, appears to be some kind of ancient necromancer with great power. But anyway, we'll get to it. Because next up, we meet Sabat's... is Gaffer? This sneery bishop called Bishop Wentnor.
I think he kind of is. I think he kind of directs him where he wants him to go and pays for him.
Yeah. He doesn't like Sabat, is not a fan of him, and resents his usefulness as an exorcist. So at this point, you're thinking, oh, he's a grumpy boss. We haven't got to the point yet where we're thinking, oh, yeah, he's probably got a point. Yeah. I'd be quite reluctant to use Sabat for anything, frankly. But there's some absolutely incredible dialogue. So it says, Sabat. Wentner smiled facially. Wentner smiled facially as he seated himself behind his huge ornate desk in his plush study. No apologies. Make the young upstart feel uncomfortable. I don't need to go into a lot of detail on this business, do I? You've read the papers, doubtless. I'd rather you did. Sabat's dark eyes never flinched, gave nothing away. The press have a habit of exaggerating these things. I'd rather have the fact first-hand. From you, Bishop. Bishop Wentner felt his pulses started to race. Sabat showed not the slightest trace of subservience, nor respect. Very well then, Sabat. Curt now, glancing at the dark-haired man sitting opposite him, but found himself dropping his gaze and staring up at the carved ceiling above, fingertips pressed together, a posture he adopted in the cathedral. It gave one a bearing of holiness, he thought, at least in the eyes of the average conventional congregation. At first it was the usual vandalism, a word sprayed on the church doors. What word? Aye, really, Sabat, this is of no consequence. Suffice to say it was an obscene one. The word, Bishop. I must collate every minute detail, every fact known, however irrelevant it may appear, if I am to conduct a proper investigation prior to an exorcism. Wentner's complexion reddened a deeper hue. He stole a glance at Sabat, but found himself looking away. Damn him, he just wants me to say that. All right then, Sabat. It was fuck! Spell it out, it sounds better that way. Sabat nodded, but gave no hint of the inner satisfaction he felt. Then the graves started being opened? That's right. One or two of the older ones were interfered with, but fortunately there weren't any living relations to kick up a fuss until they dug up this young girl, Sylvia Adams, a tragic life cut off before it began, sweet innocence itself, and then to have that happened. What did they do to her? Indescribable, and I absolutely refuse to go into details. The worst case of necromancy that has been my lot to come into contact with. Her folks, understandably, are kicking up a terrible fuss. These vile people must have brought along an animal of some kind and mating it with a corpse. The police are under the impression it was a goat, but the only trace of its cloven hooves are on the dead girl herself. Not a single print on the ground around the tomb. Sabat pursed his lips, ran his tongue along the fringe of his moustache. Celestina of Haiti was formerly married to a goat for the purposes of voodoo. Voodoo is still as rife on the island now as it was then, Bishop, and it is spread across the world to places like England. Surely you're not suggesting... It is too early to suggest anything yet. I am merely stating a few facts, but please, go on. The police drew a blank. Certainly some of the villagers know something about what's been going on, but door-to-door inquiries have come up with absolutely nothing. Then, within a month of this disgusting exhumation, yet another grave was dug up. Whose this time? Not a recent burial, I'm glad to say. In fact, the grave was just over 100 years old. A man by the name of William Gardner. And what did they do to the skeleton? I've no idea. It's never been found since. Christ alive! Sabat sat bolt upright. Bishop Wentner glared, made as if to reprimand his visitor for blasphemy, but changed his mind. He wanted to get this meeting over and be rid of Sabat. The police believe it may have been dumped somewhere. Probably it will never be found. Terrible as the desecration of these graves is, it isn't like it's murder, is it? In many cases it's far worse than murder. In the case of the Adams girl, I'll agree, but that was possibly only a taste of things to come, Bishop. Necromancy can take many forms. Possibly the Adams girl's body was merely used for vile participation in an obscene act. At least that was the original intention. Those cloven hoof prints on her body could have been implanted there by other members of this particular cult. On the other hand, he paused, possibly debating whether or not to expound his theory further. On the other hand, Bishop, they could just have succeeded in calling up the ultimate in evil. It has been done, you know. A classic case was when the infamous Aleister Crowley raised up Pan in Paris. He did just that, and as a result, Crowley spent several months in a mental institution, virtually a gibbering idiot. His companion in the experiment was struck dead. It is a known fact that such powerful evil summoned from beyond never returns empty-handed, so it would be feasible to assume that although Sylvia Adams' corpse was used for the purpose of powerful black magic, whatever was called up took another life. Thus, what became of the body? Are there any missing persons reported in the locality? Not that I know of, but you could check with police on that. Bishop Wentner's ruddy complexion was now considerably paler, and he drummed his fingers on the desktop nervously. My first task will be to try and locate the missing skeleton, Sabat's eye narrowed. Then we need to know just who these devil worshippers are. They may not be locals. Often a coven will travel many miles if they find a place suitable for their activities, and from what you tell me, St. Adrian's Church and its grounds have all the right ingredients. However, I must look further afield if necessary, but to begin with, I'll need accommodation in this village. Incognito, full expenses, and I'll let you have a scale of my charges. Bishop Wentner blanched even further, conjured up a mental picture of a recent balance sheet of diocesan accounts. Aye, well, yes, of course, but I was under the impression that exorcists did not... Charge for their services? Yes, a sort of tradition, like bone setters. A gift from God not to be exploited in monetary terms, like water diviners. Perhaps you would like us to use one of your own exorcists then, Bishop. Sabat rose to his feet, buttoning his dark serge jacket. No, Wentner held up a hand. He would have liked nothing better to have dispensed with the services of this man, but the Archbishop would not have accepted his explanation lightly. Of course you'll be paid in full. Just submit your bills. Thank you, Sabat smiled, a kind of leer that a caged lion might have given its keeper at feeding time. I shall prepare to depart for my destination tomorrow. The police are still conducting their investigation in the locality. You may care to make yourself known to Detective Inspector Plowden, who is leading the inquiry. I may, Sabat paused in the doorway and added, and on the other hand, I may not. Incredible.
What an ass.
Yeah, it's a bit of a dick, isn't he? Lewis Collins could have played him, I reckon.
Yeah, there's a good reference to voodoo, which is the first reference, isn't it, to voodoo in the book? And I know...
there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah, and did you read Warhead, Andy, or did you start it?
I got about a third of the way through it and put it down and forgot to pick it back up again. Yeah, but there is a Guy and Smith novel of bashing things together. Give us the cliff notes on Warhead, Graham.
Warhead, it's voodoo, again, some voodoo action going on there. I'm trying to remember. It's just very, very dark about a nuclear weapon. The final scene, I think, there's a disco and a massive nuclear explosion, and everyone's having a party.
Yeah. So it is like a mashup of Cold War, nuclear, atomic bomb paranoia, and voodoo. Yeah. I remember that much.
Yeah.
Finally, for chapter 1, we found out Sabat has really swish digs. It's basically half Skellen from Who Dares Wins and half something else. There should have been a series of films based on this that could have been like Rawhead Rex quality from the early 80s, but I don't think they ever in a million years would have got away with what goes on in this novel.
When I first started and I read the back and everything, it reminded me of a series I watched, I think it was early 2000s, about an ex-priest called John Strange, and he used to fight supernatural with a nurse, I remember. But that's PG in comparison to this book.
Yeah. We also found out how Sabat is. I mean, we know that he's from a wealthy family, and we know that he is to some degree self-sufficient. So why he's so hopped up on getting his expenses from the bishop, I don't know, because we found out a little bit about him. It says, Sabat returned to London and darkness had already fallen by the time he reached his exclusive West Hampstead home. Unlocking the front door, he stepped inside, paused to savour that aroma which never ceased to afford him a great deal of personal satisfaction. The smell of French polish and that almost undefinable odour which comes from antiques and antiquarian books, the flavour of accumulated wealth. He smiled faintly to himself. Life had been good to him in many ways. That terrorist armaments cache he had discovered during his SAS days, that, he decided, had been the turning point in his life, the bridge that divided a mediocre income from wealth. He could have reported it, possibly received a commendation, and within a month everybody would have forgot about it because there were bomb factories all over the country. Sabat had made a bargain with the anarchists, a hard one. In the weeks that followed, his conscience had troubled him, and he tried to console himself with the thought that he'd deprived the enemy of an awful lot of cash. They still had their high-powered rifles, machine guns and grenades, but it had cost them dearly and would set them back a lot in monetary terms. But he got over it, told himself it didn't matter either way, because the world was a jungle. Every man for himself. After that, he'd made one or two more bargains. Blackmail, if one really analysed it. He'd hit the enemy in his own way, reduced their capital resources. The sort of thing Quentin would have done. And Mark Sabat would still be doing if it wasn't for that stupid bitch of a colonel's wife who'd made her own bargain with her legs wide apart, and as a result, Sabat had found himself out of the SAS with a good kick up the arse to help him on his way. Jesus, he hated that bitch, but he couldn't stop himself getting an erection every time he thought about her.
Yeah. Where do you start with all that?
There's some stuff to unpack. Yeah.
So he stole, he did bargains with the enemy. Oh, he has no morals whatsoever.
Yeah. But he only ended up getting booted from the SAS, not because he consorted with terrorists and took money from them so they could keep their guns and machine guns and grenades and bombs. He got booted because he shagged the colonel's wife and got caught. Okay. Then his mind is invaded by Quentin for a while, and that's a bit touch and go, and he realises he's probably summoned Quentin as he knows he needs help to figure out the evil that took place in the graveyard. But, thanks to his will and advanced knowledge of yoga, he gets things under control again and goes to bed. Well, we say bed. Graham, Phil, what about his nighttime routine?
Drawing a pentagram around his bed.
Yeah.
That's my contribution.
Yeah. There's a bit more to it than that, though, isn't there?
Yeah. Oils himself up a bit, doesn't he?
Yeah. To cut a long story short, he gets naked in a pentagram, wanks himself to sleep, because he's attracted to his throbbing member like, and I quote, a magnet to iron filings. Yeah. This book, audacious stuff for establishing a hero.
I don't know what it is about sexualised priests. I think the MP book that you made me read was about sexualised weird priests.
Oh, that was the one by, was it Altony Craik, the Scottish Labour councillor, who got booted because somebody complained that he wrote Satanist filth.
Yeah, you sent them my way, didn't you?
Yeah.
I probably would have booted him for how horrendous the grammar is.
To be fair, Phil, you read the first one and were prepared to start the second one.
Oh, I couldn't. I just couldn't.
Yeah, then he sent it to me.
So when it came to, like, what do we do with this book, we sent it to Graham.
I'm not taking credit for that, Graham.
Oh, dear.
Did you read it?
I read half of it. It gave me a lot of confidence about my own writing.
It's terrible.
So were the Labour members right to complain about him writing Satanist filth? Was it that bad? Was it that foul and outrageous?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there is a lot of that sort of stuff that you can get. It was just how bad the English was for me.
Well, we found out next he drives a silver Daimler and he smokes a pipe, although in a departure from the usual Guy analogue, Sabat occasionally smokes pot in his pipe too. Yeah. Who knows? Maybe guided by the 80s. We don't know, do we? But yes, he's a pipe smoker, he's got aquiline features, he's an inveterate wanker, and he's a bit of a bad lad. But, you know, we do also get a little bit of lovely Guy and Smith stuff. You can never, ever divorce Guy from the countryside, can you? There's this lovely paragraph. It says, there was nothing untoward about the village itself, Sabat decided as he drove his silver Daimler in on the winding North Road. Once it had been a hamlet, renovated and extended agricultural cottages dating back to the 14th century. But the evil serpent of conurbation was not to be kept at bay, as the housing estates on the outskirts sprawled untidily like floodwater from a swollen river, swamping all before it, leaving just one tiny island in the middle. Oh, yeah. The evil of urban spread. So, Sabat gets some digs for a few days at the local boozer, the Dun Cow. And Guy thinks that the Dun Cow is quite a common name for boozers, but I've never come across one in the north called the Dun Cow. Is that a common one down your end, Graham?
No, I've not heard. I did a bit of looking into it. It seems to be very much around where he lived. It seemed quite popular around there. The sort of borders, Welsh borders.
Yeah, and a Dun Cow is like a reference to some kind of mythical cow.
I think so, yeah.
Can't remember what it is. But anyway, he gets digs at the local boozer and he pervs over a hot redhead sitting at the bar and gets an erection.
Doesn't take much, does it?
No, it's a general theme that he gets a hard-on at pretty much every opportunity. So he's a pipe-smoking ex-SES Warrior 10 priest and exorcist who laments how often he gets erections over whiskey and pep and bashes himself to sleep every night inside a chalk pentagram. That's a very specific character archetype, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. I do sometimes think, you know, you've got this modern trend, Graham, with role-playing games where instead of like full character classes and stuff like that, you just get a paragraph that describes the character and a couple of skills, like Troika or something. There'll be a paragraph that describes the character and then it'll be skills. So, yeah, you've got, what you got? Pipe-smoking ex-SAS Warrior 10, priest and exorcist, laments how often he gets erections, drinks whiskey and pep and bashes himself to sleep every night inside a chalk pentagram. Skills, wanking, 3, exorcism, 1.
Astral projection.
Oh, yeah, we need to include that. So, fortunately, he pops to see the Reverend of St. Adrian's before he gets his old chap out and knocks one out in the pub. And he's a nice old fella, and they bond over a pipe, which is very nice. What's he called? Reverend Staunton, isn't he? Nice old fella. He will pay for being friendly to Sabat, but not just yet. They bond over a pipe. He grants Sabat access to the parish's Doomsday Book, essentially a scrapbook of goings-on that he can take back to his digs and study for clues. And he does find something of interest, and it's a handwritten entry titled Heresy Trial. And this talks about the heresy of William Gardner. So we found out a little bit more about William Gardner. He was tried as a heretic. I can't remember what... Did they hang him or burn him or something? I can't remember. But, Gardner was the heretic and the subject of this entry, this handwritten entry in this Doomsday Book. It says, the shame of this village is something which will not be lived down for many years to come following the Crown Court trial of William Gardner, possibly the first heresy trial to be heard in England for 2 centuries. The charges were brought after the said man was seen to be holding blasphemous rites, totally unclothed, in our own sacred churchyard. Mr. Gardner had lived in the village since childhood and was known to be an atheist in spite of the efforts of the Reverend Longhorn to bring him into the fold. A bachelor who lived alone in Primrose Lane, Mr. Gardner was a loner and rarely mixed with the parishioners, although he was known to drink at the Dun Cow. On witnessing the obscene participation in unholy rites, the Reverend Longhorn advised Bishop Lacey and charges were duly brought. The Magistrates' Court committed Mr. Gardner to the assizes, but on April 30th a jury found him not guilty of heresy and Judge Wilkinson acquitted him, and in addition reprimanded the church for wasting the court's time on an outdated though still visible charge. Mr. Gardner returned to live in the village in spite of the feeling against him. He was tried for heresy, but he got away with it. The MacGuffin of this book is the bones of William Gardner. Meanwhile, Detective Inspector Plowden has been called to the river where the mutilated body of a girl has been found. A girl with goat hoof prints on her forehead. And it's poor Sheila.
Poor Sheila.
Poor Sheila. It's the body of poor Sheila. Well, chapter 3 is all action because, number 1, Sabat manages to get to sleep without wanking and decides his best port of call on the astral plane is to go and see the hot redhead Miranda because he has a sense about her. This sense must go beyond simply horniness. And fortunately, the landlord tipped him off to her address. But it turns out she's in the sack with a big hairy bloke called Royston. Now, another class choice of name here, Royston. The only other Royston I've ever come across is Royston Vasey, the true name of Roy Chubby Brown, of course. But yes, Roystus, big fat hairy bloke, and post-coitus, Sabat gets a good lowdown on the coven, the left-hand path, the death of the Virgin Sacrifice, the exhumation of Gardner's bones, the death of poor Sheila, a discoverer in the river, and Horace is now in a psychiatric hospital, and Royston has taken charge. So he gets all this because he's basically watching Royston, post-shag, essentially explain the plot so far, which is quite useful. But Sabat also realises that the coven have made him and his unprotected body feel at risk from physical assault, so he flees back to the pub to find it on fire and gets back into his corporeal form just in time to escape, although he does end up unconscious in East Birmingham Hospital for 3 days, where he's visited by D.I. Plowden, who don't really like him. They don't get along very well. And it's far too hard, though, to recuperate from a burning beam to the bonds and smoke inhalation, so he heads back to see Reverend Staunton to fill him in on details.
Let's go for it.
You really ought not to have come back.
The Reverend Staunton dribbled down the stem of his pipe and shook his head in disapproval, the way he did during his sermons on the wickedness of the world.
But if you won't go back to hospital, perhaps I could offer a bed. Since my dear wife passed away, I have ample sleeping accommodation in this huge rumbling place.
I'll be pleased to accept your hospitality.
Sabat smiled.
But not convalesce. The Dun Cow will not be operating residentially for some time to come, I fear, and I shall need a headquarters. But, Reverend, I would appreciate my return here not being advertised. People will find out soon enough. Oh, and I'm dreadfully sorry about your Doomsday Book. I'm afraid it has gone for good in the fire.
It is a small price to pay for your life.
Staunton made gooey noises in his pipe to attempt to clear some obstruction, which was preventing it from drawing to his satisfaction.
But did you manage to find anything out from its pages before it was destroyed?
Briefly, Sabat told him of his discovery concerning William Gardner. Staunton's eyes widened, and he abandoned the task of blowing down his pipe.
How awful,
he muttered when his visitor had finished.
How perfectly awful. And you are convinced, Mr. Sabat, that they actually called up?
The most powerful evil entity which it is possible to summon.
Sabat nodded.
One that does not return empty-handed. The man, Horace, who is now in a mental hospital, knew this, which was why he offered a prostitute, Sheila Dawson, along with the dead virgin. He realised that if he was successful, his master would demand a life, and he wasn't going to take any chances on any of themselves being singled out. By the way, can you throw any light on a big man called Royston, I don't know his second name, who is now running the coven and appears knowledgeable, powerful and dangerous than ever friend Horace was?
Maurice Staunton shook his head, pursed his lips.
No, I'm afraid I can't. Had you not better request the police to trace him?
No.
Sabat smiled wanly.
I'm afraid Detective Inspector Plowden has already made clear his views on my investigation, so not wishing to be hindered by petty restrictions, I shall work alone.
And what is your next step?
My ultimate aim is to find the bones of William Gardner and exorcise them, thereby destroying the evil which festers in them. But there are many things to do before then. I must find the man called Royston in his new temple of devil worship, but to do that I shall have to venture onto the astral plane again, and to do that I must restore myself to full health. A matter of a few days, hopefully. In my present state of weakness, I would be easy prey for the vultures of darkness. However, I think my initial task will be to cleanse your churchyard of the evil which exists there, to render it a place of peace and quietness again, somewhere which can never again be used by the followers of the left-hand path. I must exorcise it, Reverend.
The other nodded. Once he'd attended an exorcism service, a few prayers, muttered incantations by the exorcist. The curate's personal opinion was that the whole affair was a lot of mumbo-jumbo, nothing to get excited about, even though it appeared to have done the trick. But Sabat knew different, realised and accepted the dangers, and this time they were going to be increased 100-fold. It was his big test, his first direct confrontation with the dark forces, apart from that psychic attack upon himself, since Quentin's soul had merged with his own. On that occasion in his own home he had fought and overcome a single entity. Next time he would be challenging the evil powers in force, a single mortal outnumbered, relying on just his own faith and strength. It was suicidal, his soul at stake with Quentin, ready to pounce and aid his own kind. Sabat looked at his watch. 2:30 p.m.
Now, Reverend, I'll take advantage of your kind offer and get some rest. I'd be obliged if you would see that I'm not disturbed for the next 6 hours, and then I shall ask you to pray for me while I go alone to St. Adrian's churchyard in an attempt to drive out the evil that began with the internment of William Gardner and has grown in power over the years. 'Tis a battle I must win for a lot of reasons.
So, he has a good kip, he's got his crucifix, some garlic, his 38 revolver, and he's ready to exercise some church and graveyard. And exercise it all he does, although it's a peculiar lark. The church bit does seem fairly conventional, throwing holy water around, chanting and praying. The churchyard, on the other hand, big psychic fight against the coven, on which he calls on the Creole entity Baron Cemeteire, the Baron of the Cemetery, to take him to task for desecrating his ground. Lays about himself with a big cruciform sword, swears at them all, refers to himself in the third person, decapitates and dismembers them, then sees a manifestation of saucy Miranda the Redhead. So, he psychically rapes her, much to her disgust, although he does oddly justify it to himself as being done on the behalf of the Baron of the Cemetery. There's something to unpack. To break this down, Sabat is in the graveyard, fighting what appears to be hideous manifestations of the Coven, rather than their literal selves, because they're all fucked up and semi-decayed and rotting and corrupted, so he's not only fighting them, he's dominating them with a huge crucifix cum sword, all the while shouting and swearing at them that there is no escape from Sabat, you fuckers, and such like. But when he recognises Miranda, the foxy redhead, and that her skin is white and unblemished beneath her rotting garments, rather than dismembering her like, for example, the hideous old crone he just beheaded, he singles her out for special attention and forces himself upon her triumphantly, which is slightly disturbing for the hero of our tale. And at the end of the passage confirms that this is all a psychic battle because Royston and Miranda drive past, and Miranda has convinced Royston that they need to scoot by. So it says he almost ignored the approaching car and probably would have done had it not slowed when it drew level with him. Even at their lowest ebb, his extra perceptive senses were not totally dulled, seeing everything in those split seconds before the silver Mercedes picked up speed and was lost to sight around the bend. The driver, a big man with receding hair and the stamp of merciless cruelty on his features, eyes narrowing and hooded like a hunting hawk that has suddenly spotted its prey. But it was Royston's companion who succeeded in thrusting a stabbing pang of fear into Sabat's heart. Auburn hair, mocking green eyes, none other than Miranda, the hussy off the new estate who spread her favours in a constant search for power. She had brought Royston here at this early hour to show him that he had failed in his attempt to destroy Sabat, and she hated the man who stood there on the pavement because she knew that she had been raped and mutilated in a psychic encounter that went back to a dark age, and it had happened as surely as if Sabat had gone into her house in his physical body and carried out that unspeakable attack upon her. Now she demanded vengeance, urged her evil lover to use every vestige of his black power to help her achieve that, and Sabat's most dangerous enemy would be the resurrected evil that had once stalked this peaceful village in the form of William Gardner. Right. She has full awareness of what is done to violate her. She's righteously pissed off. The narrative acknowledges that degradation, and even Sabat himself acknowledges how degrading it was and that she has now got it in for him. At this point, this is in no way portrayed as erotica or having any kind of lascivious angle. Exercising the graveyard really meant psychically and sexually dominating those of the left-hand path and giving the graveyard over to an alternative evil entity to deny them. Make sense of this for me, someone.
Yeah, I can't. It's the robbing Peter to pay Paul, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
get rid of these evil entities at the church, lad.
Yeah. Well, as I say, he goes all in, doesn't he? Into sort of it shows his dark side, his left-hand path. At this point, you kind of it hints at it all the way through, but at this point, it really is. You know, he's just as evil as everyone else, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. At no point have we ever got a sense that he follows the right-hand path. He's an arsehole from the very start, and he continues to be an arsehole throughout.
He could have redeemed himself had he shredded all of these entities, but the fact he chose to rape the one that looked like Miranda says so much about him.
For Sabat, it's all about his boner, as usual. But I suppose in a way that's a pretty good encapsulation of the subject matter, because Satanism, the occult, at its core, like most power fantasies and exercises in domination, spiritual or otherwise, usually boils down to some bloke with a hard-on wanting gratification, doesn't it? That's pretty much at the core of all of this stuff. I think what's probably more surprising about this book is that he's fully engaged in it and using it as a weapon and really not differentiating himself in really any way from the villains. And that's the first problem with the Sabat character. In terms of 1982 lascivious, nasty, violent exploitation fiction, this is, I mean, fucking hell, we haven't even got going yet either, have we? Because at this point, it's like, oh my God, he's psychically raped her and she's really pissed off. So you think, right, okay, if you're going to try and make any attempts to justify any of this stuff from the perspective of a horror narrative, you've got this flawed hero, well, not hero, you've got this evil anti-hero, it's even a stretch, you've got this evil anti-hero, villainous, wanker rapist type. And okay, we can say at the moment, it was a psychic battle, there was no physical rape. Well, spoiler, he makes it physical almost immediately, which fucking blew my mind. I just couldn't believe what I was reading, because I said to Phil, when I got to this bit, Phil said, are you up to the oof bit yet? And I said, oh, I've just read this bit. Was that the oof bit? And Phil went, well, there's more to come. I was like, oh, holy shit. Right, yeah. So, this book is all round surprising. Because it turns out that getting the entity known as Baron Scimitar involved in things has unintended consequences too, because he claims the life of poor old Reverend Staunton as payment. Poor Reverend Staunton. Staunton is the only nice character in this entire book.
Yeah.
And
poor Morris.
Poor Morris. So Sabat is a bit of a disaster zone, if truth to be told. Since he turned up, the pub's burned down, the Reverend's dead, the churchyard is now the domain of an evil West Indian graveyard voodoo god thing of not insignificant power. And only after all this does it occur to him that he should maybe have offered the old Reverend some protection by convincing him to sleep in a pentagram. So at this point I'm thinking, you know what, he should have stuck to embassy sieges, because he's fucking terrible at this.
Yeah.
Has he done anything useful yet? Or successfully?
No.
No. Well, we're 70 pages in. No, nothing. Nothing good.
Well, let's give him the benefit of the doubt and see if he manages to turn things round. D.I. Plowden's back. He's unimpressed, as is the bishop, who pays him off and says, thanks, now sling your ruck, we're done. Job done, off you go. But Sabat, unfinished business. First, he's miffed that Royston and co tried to burn him alive in the Dun Cow, so he's going to stick around and take them to task. And second, he wants to deprive Baron Scimitar of his prize of the body and soul of Reverend Staunton. So he sneaks into the mortuary and saws the old-timer's head off with a hacksaw.
I know that sounds bad, but it does sound like this is the one good thing it does in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so he stops Reverend Staunton from becoming a Haitian voodoo zombie in the service of Baron Scimitar. But really, all he's doing there is the very, very least that he should have done, because he really should have looked after Staunton from the very outset.
Yeah.
Instead of... I mean, Staunton's in the Reverend's house. He's in the vicarage on the edge of the graveyard that Sabat has just handed over to the Baron of the Crossroads, this voodoo deity. Like, maybe it should have crossed his mind that something like this might have happened.
Not the Baron of the Crossroads, yeah.
Oh, sorry, the Baron of the Cemetery. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah, we ain't got to the Baron of the Cross yet, have we? No. Yeah, Maitre Carrefour. Carrefour. I laughed at that because, Graham, when we used to go to France on holiday, the first time I ever went to France on holiday with Phil, she was tremendously excited about going to Carrefour because Carrefour was Phil's favourite French supermarket. She was like, we're driving down roads in France, she's going, Carrefour. And now we've got Maitre Carrefour. We haven't got to him yet. But we will get Maitre Carrefour, the Baron of the Crossroads. Yes, he's handed over Staunton's graveyard to the voodoo god of graveyards. Yeah, he's fought evil with a different kind of evil by being evil. I'm not entirely sure the outcome is perfect, but anyway. Chapter 6, right, where do we start on this one? Can he redeem himself? Let's hit the checklist. Chapter 6, Sabat thinking about sex. Check. Sabat having multiple boners. Check. Hilarious passages. Check. Random reference to Sabat getting fingered. Check. What on earth brings all this on? Well, Sabat decides he needs to visit Miranda in the flesh and pump her for information. But then he gets another throbber at the very idea of it. Not helped when she answers the door in a negligee and it all goes very on the buses. Suddenly it's like Reg Varney in On the Buses. Anyway, Sabat's kicking himself for not having had a shag for 2 weeks. So Sabat puts all of this down. The fact that he can't control his raging boner, that he hasn't had a shag for 2 weeks and has thus left himself in a weakened state. The guy's a fucking amateur. He's totally unprepared for any of this. He knows his own proclivities, but what happens...
Yeah, but they're setting her up by saying, she's wearing a negligee, she's flirting with him,
Well, yeah, but she's doing that because she wants to do him in, doesn't she? She wants to do him in for herself, she wants to do him in for Royston, and I don't think her turning up in a negligee is... this is the one thing that we can defend this book for. I don't think he's really saying that she's turning up with a negligee because she's asking for it. I think she's turned up in a negligee because she wants to seduce him and kill him. which is perfectly fine femme fatale behaviour. But Sabat himself is like, well, I've got a raging boner here. I've got no power to resist this because I haven't had a shag for 2 weeks. You know, at least Sabat's admitting that he's left himself in a weakened state before he gets over to what he's doing. But the thing that made me laugh out loud was it said, suddenly Sabat found himself at a disadvantage. The tables turned, a kind of helplessness creeping over him. Sex had always been his big weakness, but he had not realised, until now, how much it dominated his makeup. Hell, he shouldn't have gone a whole fortnight without a woman. He found himself nodding, a pleasant sensation spreading out from his lower regions into the rest of his body. He didn't care about anything anymore, except... God, it was as though he was a spectator from afar looking down at his own actions. Pleasure first, business afterwards. There was no reason why he should not have his cake and eat it. Well, she laughed. She had set a drink down on the cabinet, stood facing him, arms akimbo. Somehow that flimsy garment had come undone, and he could see an elongated strip of nudity right the way down her. Jesus, her pubics were jet black. That meant her auburn hair was just a fake. Black suited her. He'd always had a preference for brunettes. I'm right, aren't I? And if you stick it out any longer, Mr. Sabat, you're likely to burst your zip. Say, don't you have a first name? Now we're getting on intimate terms. Mark. Somehow his voice sounded different, muffled. He'd only once before got himself into a state like this, and that was in a Soho sauna, where the masseuse had begun to finger him. Oh, dear.
We're not trying to blame it on trauma, are we?
No, I don't think we are. Oh, fucking hell. Anyway, before he knows it, he's butt naked on a sofa. She's convincing him to masturbate, which he has zero problem with. But before he can reach his peak of wankstacy, she tries to stab him. So he overpowers and rapes her. And at that point, I laughed out loud at that chapter, and I thought, yeah, it's all got a bit on the buses. And then, yeah, he just rapes her. And it's like, oh, for fuck's sake. For fuck's sake, this book.
Yeah.
And then she tells him all about Royston over a couple of emotional whiskies. They'd set up a new temple and told her she had to seduce and kill him. She has tried to kill Sabat, but now she's tried to kill him. It seems to have, and failed, and he's raped her. It seems to have broken her resistance. And it's so baffling the way this goes. After this, Sabat has convinced he's onto a winner, and he thinks to himself, I probably won't have to rape her next time. And Miranda is thinking that, for a ruthless evil rapist, she could just grow to like him, so long as he doesn't ask any questions about the pub fire that nearly killed him. Which, of course, she was involved in. Was this the oof moment, Phil, where you thought, holy shit, I'm going to finish this for the podcast, but I would definitely not finish this book if I had a choice?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just read what she had said. Never once had she felt anything for one of her lovers. Just a physical relationship, nothing more. But this time it had been different. Even when Sabat was raping her and she had fused with him. What? Yeah. It's just, yeah. Even when. It's just, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what? This will be our 96th episode, right? And I am not sure I have ever been lost for words about something we've read. But it gets to a point where I really don't know what to say about it other than, what the fuck have I just read?
Yeah. I concur. Not sure what else you can say really about it.
Yeah.
Because she felt that Sabat was better than Royston, and all I've thought was, my God, your standards are so low.
Yeah.
Oh, she's so damaged.
We do get a little bit of her background, don't we? She was the daughter of a prostitute. She moved out here to be a prostitute. She picks up her... But you know what? That is not a suitable or appropriate justification for any of this. Even if we're thinking this book was written... And you know what? I fucking love reading my Guy and Smith books. But this one is a touch too far in a number of ways. And I think what makes it all the more difficult is that there is nothing in here to redeem this at any stage.
And I'm pretty sure as well that Sheila was a prostitute as well. So all the female characters are...
Oh, there is one thing. There is one thing as we get towards the end where I thought, oh, we're going to get something potential which is going to redeem things. We're going to get... But we'll get to that. So Royston rings up. Miranda lies, says she stabbed Sabat to death. So the Royster says, I'll be over the following evening to do some crazy shit to his corpse. Because, you know, that's what we do. So Sabat decides he's going to lay a trap, get some rest, maybe have a shag. But Miranda's not up for the shagging bit.
Good for her.
It's like, you know, the fact... It's like, oh, I know I raped you last night, but you fancy a shag?
Yeah.
So he has a kip, dreams about a mad sacrifice in a crypt with Royston and loads of sex-crazed cultists, and on waking, he realised his astral projection, his astral body had been drawn to a premonition, deliberately drawn. But who is it that will be sacrificed? He doesn't know. What a mystery. Oh, well, we'll find out straight away. It'll be Miranda. Because while he asses about with her car for about half an hour, and she's ruminating how ace it was getting raped by Sabat, she gets snatched by someone who leaves behind the smell of a grave. Oh no, how will he save her? He doesn't. Spoiler. Major spoiler. Miranda does not get saved. She gets horrifically sacrificed.
Well, that's because he's in his car having one of his fights with Quinton.
That's right, because he decides, right, okay, I need to talk to the Archbishop on the blower and get a tip. So he gets a tip that an expert on spooky, unused church crypts or something is a guy called Reverend Spode. Ah, Spode. Bit of a P.G. Woodhouse connection there. Yeah. So Reverend Spode, an expert on spooky, unused church crypts. So instead of ringing him, Sabat, who knows that Miranda has been kidnapped, decides to drive to see Reverend Spode. Why he doesn't just think I'll fucking ring him? No, he drives to see Reverend Spode with no real explanation of why. But he has to contend with a double whammy of supernatural stuff and an attack of the Quentins. So he drives into Crazy Mist, and then Quentin has a psychic attack. He has a psychic battle with Quentin, and then he's exhausted, so he falls asleep in the car. While he's sleeping in the car, Miranda gets taken to the crypt, forced to lay with the skeleton of William Gardner, then gets her throat cut, and in a final moment, as she's bleeding out, watches her own demise from her astral body a few feet above her physical one. Unlucky Miranda. What what treatment you've had in this. Yeah, ouch. That is like the worst 36 hours that you could possibly have, isn't it? Attend a churchyard sex cult ceremony where loads of people get killed, then get psychically raped in the same graveyard, then get physically raped by the guy who raped you, then think, oh, actually, yeah, maybe this rapist guy ain't so bad. He goes out to look at your car, you get kidnapped, and while he's driving to see someone called Reverend Spode and falling asleep in the car after a bit of tribulation, you get brutally murdered. That is a tough gig.
So he packs it into the pages, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He does, actually.
Yeah.
Not that it's good, but he packs it in.
So back at the Daimler, Sabat recovers from his untimely psychic battle with Quentin, but just in case that wasn't enough, he has another problem to deal with, and just as we have to process another one of Sabat's strange character quirks. Here we go. So just in case you thought Sabat had any redeeming qualities whatsoever, let's take a look at this. Suddenly he saw the motorcyclist, a hurtling, denim-clad rider coming towards him, taking the left-hand bend too wide and too fast, unhelmeted, so that an expression of terror was visible even in that fraction of a second. Sabat's reaction was as sharp as ever, pulling the wheel over, mounting the grass verge, miraculously avoiding a head-on collision. Now, everything was slow motion, every detail hideously accentuated as though deliberately to torture the two men. The biker was alongside the Daimler, a stunt rider doing crazy aerobatics as his machine reared like a plunging rodeo mount. Sabat had two fields of vision. In his wing mirror, he watched the riderless motorbike hit the ground and career in a diagonal course for the opposite ditch, while through the windscreen he saw the thrown rider reach his apex, arms and legs kicking like a skydiver, coming down, so slowly, head first, long blonde hair flowing, mouth wide to emit a terrible scream. For one awful split second the two men exchanged glances, the clear blue eyes of the doomed youth blazing terror and hate. "You killed me, you bastard! Murderer!" Sabat seemed to feel the impact of bones smashing on tarmac, a stomach-churning thud that vibrated through the car. Still, it was slow motion. An action replay of a gymnast's headstand, except that the performer now had no head. Smashed bone and pulped flesh, a morass that was scarlet with stringy grey frog spawn, still tottering in a vertical position, then slowly collapsing. It had seemed an eternity, yet could have lasted no more than a few seconds. Sabat's pulses had started to race, but he checked them, psychologically steadying every nerve as he had been trained to do during his SAS service. He opened the door, eased himself out, stood looking down on the bloody remains of what had once been a human being. Shredded clothing, a gash that opened at the stomach so that the entrails spilled out, yards of coiled human piping. Sabat glanced up and down the road. There was nobody in sight. Probably this unfortunate victim of their brief encounter was a farm labourer speeding on his way to keep an appointment with a herd of cows whose udders were full to bursting. No sadness, no revulsion, seeing things as they were, as fate had ordained. Alive one second, dead the next. A gamble millions of people won or lost with every passing day. Sabat turned away, got back into his car. There was nothing he could have done anyway. Had the other still been alive, he would have put him out of his misery with the same impartiality with which a vet dispatches a suffering animal. He'd done it once before. A swift blow with a starting handle to the head of a young girl mutilated beyond recognition in the wreckage of a Mini. Instant death was preferable to prolonged suffering. God gave life and God took it away, and as man was part of God, Sabat had felt justified in his decision.
Wouldn't you thought he'd at least have thought, I'll do last rites or something? I know he's an ex-priest, but...
Yeah.
He's so cold.
Yeah.
I think just a couple of paragraphs on from there, there's a bit where it says, Sabat should have been able to relax, but for some reason, he could not.
Just what? Not only is he an inveterate wanker, not only is he a psychic and physical rapist, not only did he extort terrorists for money so they could keep their hand grenades, rifles and machine guns, despite the fact that later on we find out that he tortured and killed a terrorist prisoner for hours because that vermin don't deserve to live. Not only that, but also he once smashed an injured girl's brain in when she was trapped in the wreckage of a Mini after a car crash because he thought it was the right thing to do.
So as not to prolong her agony. What a gentleman.
Oh my God. Oh, it's incredible. I think I got to the point where my shock at the antics of this character, I say antics in inverted commas, it becomes almost, it's starting to become almost a parody of itself. And I do wonder when Guy was writing this, whether he was chewing on his pipe, chuckling to himself, thinking, how far can I push this? Just how far down the shitter can I take my hero? Because that really is just, it's like, it's jumping the shark. It's just so fucking outrageous. Anyway, weird penchant for mercy-killing car crash victims aside, Sabat makes it to Spode's vicarage and meets Spode. Oh no, Reverend Royston Spode. Oh my God.
But he meets the young, nubile housekeeper Alison before that.
He does. Alison, the wonderfully beautiful, brown-skinned, West Indian housemaid. Oh, who gives him drugged coffee? Well. I wonder if Alison will turn out to be important to the plot. Yeah, well, she will. So, Sabat, you're hard to like. You're a rapist, you're a wanker. This Royston Lacker has stitched you up like a kipper. And as if things couldn't be bad enough for Miranda, even in death. Now, Sabat's drugged now, but is astrally projecting from his drugged body. So it says, Sabat's astral body looked down upon his sleeping, pale physical form. He grimaced at what he saw. His drugged features had a pallid corpse... Fuck's sake. Right. Give me a second. I obviously need more booze in order to get to the end of this book. I mean, you know, we're getting there. We're rattling through this. But, I thought, right, I've pulled out Tango Dark Berry rather than Jamaica Ginger Beer. So, As fate decrees, I'm going to have Bacardi, raspberry, and Tango Dark Berry. What a combination. Will it be too much fruit? Will I be able to cope with it? I don't know. But I'll just wet my whistle.
I have not seen as you stole my Bacardi.
What do you mean your Bacardi? Surely it's our Bacardi. It's house Bacardi.
I bought it from my gingerbread shots.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's delicious with Tango Dark Berry, anyway. Still half a bottle left, so you're all right. There's a bit left for you. Right, where were we? Okay. Sabat's astral body looked down upon his sleeping pale physical form. He grimaced at what he saw. His drugged features had a pallid, corpse-like look about them, his chest scarcely rising and falling with his ultra-shallow breathing. And beside him lay the hideous skeleton of William Gardner, the skull and arms dark with congealed blood, turned towards him as though it laughed with that horrible cavity of a mouth, and sought to embrace him with its long arms. And Miranda. Oh, Jesus, they'd pay in full for what they'd done to her. Her body lay in a recess, cast-off garbage thrown to one side to rot. Her head lolled back, exposing a huge gash the length of her neck. Her previously unblemished flesh matted and streaked with her own dried blood, and as a final insult they had parted her thighs, a mockerying death of the way she had lived. Just
how can you say that?
That one final indignity is that not only does she have that undignified end, but the final indignity is having Sabat feel sorry for her, which I think is almost as bad, possibly worse.
Because when he'd woke up in the car earlier, he'd said he knew without doubt the prostitute would be dead. He didn't even give her a name then.
But he does indeed have a scoot about the crypt, worrying about his mortal body as he does so. Sees Royston shagging Alison.
Can I just ask you both there?
Yeah.
Why is it when he goes to the astral plane, he often finds people shagging?
Because this entire book is about shagging, boners, sex.
Yeah.
Everybody's at it all the time. We even get introduced to very, very late to a new character who positions themselves almost like it could possibly be a Deus Ex Machina. Oh, yeah. And we'll get to that in a second. Because, we'll get there in a moment. So he sees Royston shagging Alison, makes mental comment about his fat ass, and then hatches a plan. He astrally projects to an ancient desert battlefield and calls on some ancient deities, chief of which being Damballa, but also Damballa's muckers, Aida Uedo, Papa Legba, and Maitre Carafor. Carafor, Lord of the Crossroads. Now, there's some god politics going on here with these gods. These are the Rada gods. And Baron Scimitar is of the Petra gods. But it turns out that Royston is somehow aligned with the Petra gods as well, which makes it even more confusing that Sabat earlier on chose to call upon Baron Scimitar. So it's all a bit of a mess, these god politics. And it's all introduced extraordinarily late in the day. So we're getting introduced to a pantheon, but it is quite vivid and interesting. Actually, I love this. The one thing you got to say about Guy is that car crash scene, all this, I love the way it's written. I think it's really vivid. It's really descriptive. I love the idea. I love the concept. But it's quite late in the day to suddenly be introducing this pantheon of gods. This should have come like a third of the way through the book.
Yeah.
I think Guy must have written books so fast that it's almost a stream of consciousness, this stuff. And I think there's some great stuff in here, but it's just sort of lost and left to flounder a little bit. But I don't know if this Petra versus Rada thing is a thing.
Yeah, I looked it up and had a bit of a read about it. Yeah, it's kind of how in sort of the sort of voodoo pantheon you have these different groups of the gods basically.
He always did his own work on this stuff, didn't he? Always did his own work. So yeah, this is all really cool, interesting stuff. And there are 3 more Sabat books, and when I bought those 2 boxes of pristine Guy and Smith books, 4 Sabat books were in there. And against all my better judgment, I do kind of want to dip into Sabat too to see if it's less rapey and has more of this stuff in it, because I like this stuff. It's good. But anyway, Sabat commits to doing for Spode & Co. in the name of Damballa. And they say, all right then. But going back to his body turns out to be a bit of a problem. It was the smell he noticed first, stronger than before, a sickening odour of rotting flesh and death mingled with the acrid, unmistakable aroma of blood. Terror such he had never experienced before in astral form. Fear that he had been away too long deserted his physical body and left it totally at the mercy of the evil Royston. Even as he entered the crypt, the scene which he feared most greeted him. His own body lay there before that black altar just as he had left it, but in the light cast by the twin candles he saw the blood. His features unrecognisable beneath the sticky scarlet fluid, his dark clothing saturated so that the material clung tightly to the body. Royston Spurd had thwarted him, sacrificed him before night fell, and now that he was dead, Sabat's astral body was trapped in the wilderness of no return. Oh,
no.
God. Oh, how's he going to get out of this one? Well, it's all right, he's not dead, really. But, meanwhile, we get a couple of different character POVs right at the death of the book. First, we get a POV from Spurd, which is quite interesting, because Spurd is reflected on his mistress, Alison, and all the great sex they have, and the fact that he doesn't even have to rape her. It's brilliant. She does anything he wants. She'll do rough sex, she'll do gentle sex, but is a little bit worried that she might have conflicted feelings about drugging Sabat's coffee, because he sensed something in her when she took it through. Then.
I think it's more than just a housekeeper. I get the impression he almost bought her. He's her master.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he brought her over 5 years ago from Haiti
Yeah.
or something, didn't he? Yeah. And then we meet Andy Drew, a bullied homosexual man whose workmates are starting to figure out his preferences. He's been involved in the cult and is appalled by what Spurd has been doing to girls, but feels trapped by his circumstances, but decides he has to put an end to it. So as a result of thinking this is all really fucking terrible, he decides that at the right moment and at the next ceremony, what he can do to put an end to all this terrible stuff is to stab Spurd to death with his knife. So at this point, it's oh yeah, go Andy. Finally, someone in this book with an arc. Someone in this book who kind of has a fairly miserable life, who's getting bullied because of his sexual preferences at work, who engaged in this out of desperation, and is appalled by what's going on.
Did his friend get killed on a motorbike?
His
friend got killed on a motorbike, yeah, and we can read into it that his friend perhaps was someone who he had a relationship with, so it's quite tragic. Just seemed quite late to introduce a new character who may potentially, while Sabat is possibly dead or otherwise, we don't know, this guy might save the day because his arc from repressed and bullied victim of his needs to joining a coven, find himself out of his depth, determined to take corrective action. Oh, wow, cool. We're getting somewhere. It says, he slid off the bed, found his old sheath knife in the dressing table drawer, the one he'd had when he was a scout. He tested the blade with his thumb. It was sharp enough to do the trick. He'd have to kill Spurd in the church. Christ. It'd be like Thomas Becket. He'd even played a minor part in the play of the Canterbury murder they'd put on at school, but this time it would all be for real. When he knelt to receive human flesh and blood, God, it was cannibalism. Chewing on a square of that wretch's flesh, tasting a thick soup like blood. Andy wouldn't let it get that far. He'd have the knife hidden up his sleeve ready to drop down, hilt first into the palm of his hand, and as Spurd bent to save him, he'd plunge it deep into that fat belly. The others would be with him once Royston Spurd was down. Between them, they'd drag the body through the graveyard, throw it into the old crypt, fill the entrance with rubble, and no one would ever find it. Simple. Oh, yeah, this is a good plan, Andy. We like it. Andy Drew knew that he could go through with this. It was either that or take his own life, and he lacked the courage to do the latter. He grinned to himself, suddenly aware that planning Spurd's death had given him an erection. It was funny how matters irrelevant to sex somehow turned him on. Maybe he'd orgasm as he struck the death blow. The greatest thrill of his life. Build us up, knock us down. For fuck's sake. Anyway, he fucks it up and gets carved up by Spurd and dumped next to Sabat and the Bones of Gardner. Sabat, the drama queen, though, he is still alive. He was just covered in someone else's blood. He is still drugged, though. But fortunately, that deal he made with the Petra gods, or was it the other gods? I can't remember.
Petra.
Fortunately, Petra.
Rada.
Maitre Carrefour.
Sorry,
Rada. You see, yeah, I can't remember either. Fortunately, Maitre Carrefour arrives in the guise of a weird old tramp and grants him consciousness to do his deal. So Sabat swaps clothes with Andy Drew, takes up a position with his 38, and awaits Spode and Co. And even then, he manages to be a gross creep right until the very end. Sabat had his gun trained on Spode, a direct bead that would have ploughed a slug between those narrow eyes and churned a path of splintered bloody bone out through the balding crown. A professional stance, left hand gripping the wrist of his gun arm. He would not have missed. An error was out of the question. Yet he hesitated, not because of any twinge of conscience that he was blasting a sitting target from ambush. He'd done that on innumerable occasions in the past, never lost a wink of sleep over it. 2 reasons. First, he was curious, intrigued to witness the sacrifice of his own body, anticipating his secret delight when Spode discovered the deception. Second, Alison was standing right behind her master and there was a risk that the slug might take a deflection on its death course and mow her down too. He didn't feel anything for her except her body was sensuous, inviting, and he would settle his score with her in a frenzied lust afterwards. Dead, she was no use to him, so he held his fire.
He didn't want to shoot her because she might die, but because he can't shag her.
I read it would take his frenzied lust that he didn't want to kill Spode and accidentally kill her because that would deprive him of the opportunity of getting rape revenge on her.
Yeah, that's how I read it.
So he fucks it up. Because he didn't want to deprive himself of an opportunity of revenge raping Alison. He fucks things up. Spode is taken over by the bones of Gardner, becomes immune to bullets. Even though he copped a few in the head, everything goes haywire. Sabat cowers in fear. Everybody starts to die horribly because weird things start to happen. And then, turns out, Alison the West Indian lady, who was Spode's slave mistress, was the hero of this book all along. Because she saves the day.
That's because she worships the Rada gods, doesn't she?
She worships the Rada gods. She stabs him with a sacrificial knife, saves the day, takes down Spode, and then it just ends. So somewhere inside him, Quentin was cursing, a scream of profanity, the frustration of defeat, reminding Sabat that this was only the beginning. There would be other places, other evils, and the battle would rage mercilessly yet again before long. Sabat's mood changed as the miles fell away behind him. Alison slipped from his mind and was replaced by a shapely blonde in black boots with brown suspenders to match, but she too was lost in the past. Then he remembered another woman, a brunette with unusually bright eyes, who was equally as good with a select clientele, and his foot increased its pressure on the accelerator. That was another call that could not be denied. Something older than even voodoo. Yes, his favourite hooker. Right, okay, question. Let's get serious for a second. If Sabat had never turned up in the village, would the outcome have been different?
The pub would still be there.
Yep.
The Reverend would be alive.
I'm
trying to work out if Miranda would be alive, but she could have still been sacrificed.
Yep, 50-50.
Yeah.
And Alison would have still killed Spode.
Yeah, ultimately, yeah.
Yeah. Sabat turned up, wanked, raped, fucked things up across the board, got Reverend Staunton killed, got the pub burned down, and Alison just saved the world from Gardner entirely on her own.
And sacrificed herself because they needed a soul.
That's right. So Alison selflessly spends 5 years with Spode to get to the point where not only could she do what was necessary, but she could actually dispel the evil that was Spode, because we actually find out he was some kind of voodoo entity himself. So Alison exacted a years-long plan to resolve this situation on behalf of her pantheon of gods. Entirely in spite of any of the efforts of Sabat. So yeah, that was Sabat, the Graveyard Vultures, everybody. Thoughts on Sabat, the Graveyard Vultures?
Well, not on that specifically, but I like a nice protagonist. Just, just saying. I didn't get any.
You didn't get anything out of this one, then?
No.
It's very hard to be invested in a book when the sort of central character is such an arsehole.
Yeah, he had no redeeming qualities whatsoever.
This was quite a tough one, I think. This was quite a tough one. I think even though I enjoyed certain passages of it, because, you know, a guy can write blisteringly entertaining passages of violence and everything else, there was just too much wanking and rape and thoughts of rape. All of the good heroic action that took place in this book takes place off screen until the very end.
Yeah.
A book about Alison, or a book where Alison was at least more involved in the narrative and you got more of a sense of who she is, so maybe there could even be some kind of twist or anything. Yeah, I don't know. But I think it's one of the things certainly about this... Yeah. Sorry, go on, Graham.
I was going to say, what you just said there, if it wasn't Sabat and the whole story was around Alison and the voodoo pantheon, the Petro and the Rada gods, that could have been really epic, couldn't it?
Really
I want to read that book.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what, Guy, we love you and we've loved reading your books, but I think all I can really say on this one, you know what, not for me. Not for me, this one.
No, not for me.
Although, just in case there is more of that voodoo pantheon stuff going on and less of the other, I am tempted to dip into Sabat 2 and see what's going on. I will do at some point. Yeah. I'm not going to give Sabat the benefit of the doubt, but I will give Guy the benefit of the doubt, because Guy is writing these page turners for a market like he did with all his books. And I think, he probably got to a point with Sabat where there was so much competition with these kind of novels where he's pushing the envelope further and further and further. I mean, we've not even got to Bamboo Gorillas, have we? And apparently that's a bit hair-curling in places.
But I love the crabs. I really enjoyed the crabs.
Yeah. Crabs rule.
Crabs are good.
Crabs rule. Well, you know what? Thank you both for persevering through technical problems, but also for persevering through, I know what for you, Phil, was a pretty rough book that you wouldn't have finished had we not been doing this. And also, this being your first appearance in a year since last Halloween is appalling, and we need to make plans. And Graham, pleasure as always to have you in. Can't wait to read The Woodlice.
Me too.
And we'll talk about that one when it comes out. Do some readings. We'll get back together at some point soon. We'll figure something out. Possibly, I think we've got to continue down that Peter Cave rabbit hole, I think, haven't we? Yeah,
I think Peter Cave. I've started Crime Commandos. I'm enjoying it.
Oh, yeah. At the moment, I've got a lot of homework to do over the next 2 or 3 weeks because, of course, with Halloween, generally we knock quite a few out quite quickly. But come mid to late November, I might actually have some time to just read something purely for enjoyment rather than the podcast. So I think I'll line up Crime Commandos for that moment. Yeah. But thank you both very much, and we'll see you next time.
Brilliant.
Been a pleasure.
So we are back in Derry and Tom's because we decided that we would record what we're going to call a Sabat supplemental. Because I don't know about you, Graham, but even after our reading of it and our discussion of it, it was stuck in my head. And I have thoughts about it. I don't know about you, but what were you thinking?
Yeah, it was interesting. So when I read it, I was in two minds about the whole point of Sabat and how Sabat 1 introduced him as a character, and the plot. It just seemed a bit weak, really. That as we sort of surmised, he didn't really do anything, and he caused lots of problems. and really, the story should have been about someone else. So we had this almost like a hapless protagonist. It was pretty horrible, but there was something. I think there was something missing, and I wanted to understand what it was. And I think moving on to Sabat 2, I think I understand what was missing in Sabat 1.
Yeah. Now, I think it's fair to say that we had a wee messaging discussion last week, and I took Sabat 2 away with me to a castle near Hexham, and I read it really, really quickly. Because I think it's fair to say that Sabat 1 was a challenge to our normally good-humoured approach to the world of 70s and 80s horror schlock. We've had some bits in books that have been harsh and challenging, but never anything quite this. Because when you think about, a book like this and what I expected from a Sabat book, right? Okay, crazed satanic sex cults. Fine, expected. Violence and horror. Yeah, sure. Rapey sacrifices on the part of the villainous cult. See, already a Freudian slip. Yeah. Par for the course, really, with this kind of genre. But talking of the cunt, ex-SAS priest stroke exorcist who don't follow no rules from the man, aka the Archbishop, but ploughs his own path to combat evil. Cool, fine, we like that. Compulsive wanker too, surprising, but funny. But it just went off a bit at the deep end with the hero also being not just a man with strong sexual proclivities, but a straight rapist. And the suggestion that this behaviour might be tied in some way to his overall life experience and having a homosexual experience as a youth that he enjoyed but experienced shame for, etc., etc., etc. All a bit weird. So evidently a complex character that resolves his internal conflicts by endlessly fantasising about women in suspenders and nearly rubbing his knob off in frustration, but then manifesting those inner conflicts manifesting them further by raping women, and certainly in the case of the first book, expressing internal frustration that he can't punish rape the actual hero of the book for drugging his coffee. Yeah, bit much. Am I overreading that?
I don't. No, I think that's what I came away with in that book. But I think the thing I missed, and I don't think I missed it, but I think it wasn't used as much as in Sabat 2. Was Quentin and his influence of him actually switching Mark, as it were, and how he behaves. And I think if there was more overt that it was actually, from my reading of it, Quentin, the horrible, evil part of Sabat as the pair, then it kind of, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, because Sabat 2 leans much more explicitly into the battle with Quentin, and at one point Quentin, the narrator makes more of an effort to represent the passages where Quentin is basically driving.
Yeah.
So when he's a horrible prick, it's more identifiably Quentin in charge.
Yeah.
Now, had that been more clearly delineated in book 1, and we got the sense more directly that Sabat's behaviour was being driven by having Quentin's soul essentially sharing a space in his brain with his own, maybe that would have made it easier to take. I don't know, it still would have been pretty bad, but I don't. The subtext might be there and maybe I missed it. I don't know, but yeah, I think that could have been leaned into more heavily to make that point. And like, is it Quentin in his brain that makes him use a tire iron to beat a injured woman to death who's crashed her Mini? Is that Mark Sabat or is that Quentin Sabat? At what point did he do that in the past?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that duality, I think, makes this second book much better. But the good thing about the second book is, even though we get the bits with Quentin driving, at no point does he beat an injured woman to death with a tire iron. At no point does he rape a woman. And the treatment of female characters, even though the main female character other than the villain is a brothel madam, the treatment of that character is much more sympathetic.
Yeah.
Even though she still fucking dies horribly due to Sabat's actions.
Yeah. In that, there's a lot more respect, isn't there, in there? And even at the very end of the book, he doesn't do what you would expect from the first book to the main Lilith, as it were. Was it? What's her name? Katerina, or I can't remember.
Katerina, Catriona.
Yeah. So there's. It kind of almost seems like a different character.
It does. It feels very different. I mean, the weird thing about these books is the first 3 were all published in 1982, and the 4th one was published in 1983. And you definitely get the sense that he's writing these, he's typing pages and throwing them over his shoulder, Moorcock style, even faster probably. Yeah. And maybe he's writing his way into this. Maybe the first book is a reaction to him wanting to do something different and harsh. The second book is a lot more assured, a lot more settled. The character is much more interesting. He still wanks, but interestingly, one of the things that I checked out when we'd finished the first ones, I thought, I wonder if he continues to wank unabated through the rest of the series. So I just flipped through the first few pages of the books to find out. And in Sabat 2, he's ham-shanking by the 8th page, right? Although, to be fair, he does get interrupted because the phone rings. He's been wanking for 20 minutes and hasn't managed to bring himself off. But the phone rings and he's not able to actually get to it. In Sabat 3, he manages to hold off until page 13.
Okay.
So that's some kind of progress. And in Sabat 4, it's page 29. But in his defence, he's poorly in Sabat 4. And when he does finally make it to the 5-knuckle shuffle, oh well, it is a spectacular one. And there's about a page of it. It is absolutely incredible. And if we ever talk about Sabat again in the future, maybe we'll get into that, into a little bit more detail. That sounds entirely wrong, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sounds like a very different podcast.
Yeah, it does. And you know what? I picked up on something the other day as well. I should have been prepared for Sabat, because, at least to some degree, because when it was voted top in the Patreon poll, Alistair Davison messaged me to say, looking forward to hearing what you think of Sabat. I read it last week, found it to be a strange mix of great writing and what the fuck moments. He gets erections a lot. Now there's something I never expected to type. So, Alistair, you gave me fair warning. You gave me absolutely fair warning.
And yeah, I because I hadn't read it before, but I had read about it, and I'd kind of put it to one side in my head, sort of knowing about, actually he was a rapist, and I'd kind of almost forgotten about it. I think I was sort of wrapped up in reading some of the other Guy N. Smith's books, and I kind of forgot that was a main part of establishing Sabat as a character, and I kind of I think the second one is just better written. It flows better, and there's the sort of descriptive parts just really fits, and the whole thing about Lilith and the owl, and there's the owl hooting, and there's some nice bits about the occult, talking about Kabbalah and the parts of the Tree of Life, and there's some really nice bits in there, and it just feels more whole.
And not only that, and I think it is a really interesting case of reading two books which might have been written when an author was in a different mood or in a different stage. When they're all written in the same year, you can't really make any claims to something like with Moorcock, where he writes an Elric book, I don't know, that's set before one written in 1968 and he writes it in 1984 or something like that. These are all written back to back, pretty much. He might have written other things between them, but he's writing them really quickly. But it definitely feels like he's in a different headspace when he's writing this book, because Sabat's still getting lob-ons all over the place, but it's more of a conventional crime mystery structure. We find out more about him. He's got an actual character. We find out about his motivations. We find out he's not averse to just eating an entire plate of coleslaw because he's such a physical purist, which I thought was hilarious. When he sent me that the picture of that paragraph, I'd just laughed out loud at that the night before. I literally lolled. It was incredible.
And he likes to drink whiskey and mint cordial,
whiskey and pep. Yeah.
And
he refers to whiskey and pep in the first book.
Yeah.
And I thought, what's whiskey and pep? And I probably should have Googled it. But then he actually refers to peppermint cordial in this. Yeah. Whiskey and peppermint cordial.
Yeah.
Ooh, I'm not sure about that. But I suppose if it's the 1970s and all you can get is fucking bells or something like that, maybe you need some peppermint cordial to make it palatable. I don't know.
An interesting Quentin gin person.
Yes. And there is actually a small hint in the narrative that Mark thinks that gin is the drink of the evil people. So, yeah, again, you've got that neat delineation of when Quentin's in charge because he starts drinking gin. Yeah, which was quite good fun. But, he's also got this protective streak when it comes to prostitutes, because we find out there's a major character who's Ilona, who's a brothel madam, who we find out essentially saved him from committing suicide when he was a young man and he was tortured and conflicted. and he found comfort and a form of love with this brothel madam. So he has this protective streak when it comes to prostitutes, and Ilona in particular. And when we find out that the villainous murderizers are the disciples of Lilith, who are basically skinhead, Nazi, disaffected youth types, classic late 70s, early 80s skinheads, are stabbing them in the throat and bleeding them out, he has this really protective, he takes this really protective position of the prostitutes. Unfortunately, he does, spoilers, he does get Ilona involved, and it gets her killed and gets two of our girls killed really, really awfully as well, which is Sabat being a bit of a dimwit again, which happens a bit. He's got a fellow ex-SAS colleague geezer that he trusts in the CID called Clive, his mate Clive, who's a sergeant. And we found out that the colonel and the SAS who got him discharged for shagging his missus, who was also binned off for being sympathetic to a far-right group called the Liberation Front, who were a Nazi splinter sort of... They're basically, I'm not going to say the name of these people, but they're basically the kind of wankers you get on the street right now. Yeah. But, the late 70s, early 80s version. And so this colonel, whose wife Catriona is the one that Sabat was shagging, are the central villains of the piece. Yeah. So we find out a little bit more about them, and this little world of Sabat is nicely expanded. And on top of all this, Sabat hates Nazis. Yeah, which is what you want from your ex-SAS priest hero. Yeah. You want a Nazi killer, and we get one.
Yeah, and there's some there's some really good scenes of him being that ex-SAS type person. Yeah. So in the first book, he just seemed to fail constantly. And maybe that was important to establish that. But he never really succeeded in anything that he needed to succeed in. But in the second one, he was doing the things you'd expect that sort of hard nut to do, right? And it kind of worked.
Yeah, absolutely. So you get the sense in this that, okay, he should have been a little bit smarter and not got Ilona and her girls killed, right? But he's not nearly as fucking useless as he is in the first book. And in this, we do get the sense that he is competent. And there are some excellent bits. There's one great line where it says, "The Daimler seemed to pick up its driver's mood of frustration, the usually smooth engine sluggish and missing on more than one occasion. It was because Sabat was an excellent and sensitive driver, becoming part of the car once he was behind the wheel." So I've got this lovely Alan Partridge style, like almost Garth Marenghi. You almost expect him to be wearing sports casuals and like leather open-backed driving gloves when he's doing all of this. But also there's this, I think where it really, really kicks in for me, and I realised that this was the book that I wanted the first one to be, was Chapter 6. Yeah. Where Chapter 6, pretty much in its entirety, is what I wanted from these books, where, he knows that things are going bad. He knows that these skinheads are out there. I can't remember at this point whether he knows that Catriona and the ex-SAS colonel are the villains of the piece. I think he's probably figured this out by now. And it's just incredible. He sets a trap for Nazi skinheads in his gym, because we find out he's got this massive gymnasium in his basement under his muse house. And there's this fucking amazing passage. It says, Sabat's mind was elsewhere on the journey back to the house, a robot that drove with deadly efficiency, but recorded none of the mundane details in a computerized brain that had no space for trivialities. On entering his front door, Sabat knew that his first task was to kindle the flames of fury, bring them to a raging furnace and burn them back to a simmering anger, for in his present state it was likely to cloud his reasoning, his judgment, and that gave these disciples of Lilith a distinct advantage over him. He descended a flight of stairs which led to the basement area below, a square room which incorporated the foundations of the house and which he had fitted out as a gymnasium. In some ways it bore a resemblance to Ilona's cellar, yet the fixtures and fittings were not designed for such masochistic pleasures. A vaulting horse, climbing ropes, a punch bag, various trapeze bars, and at the far end a miniature shooting range against the background of a sand pit. Sabat stripped naked, his muscles quivering with both anticipation of the exertion they faced and the fury which seethed inside the powerful body like a cauldron coming to the boil. The scar on his cheek stood out starkly as though it glowed white-hot. His eyes burned hot and dry. The punchbag first, a rain of blows that powered every ounce of his 180 pounds, fast and furious, every one on target, straining the ropes that secured the leather bag to its moorings. He saw it through a red haze, an unknown face that belongs to the self-styled Führer of this fascist movement, determined to pound it beyond recognition. Sabat saw Ilona again, the tragic waste of life, and knew that only total revenge would ease his own conscience. Faster, faster, the thudding of bare knuckles on leather like distinct machine gun fire, his body slathered in sweat, his eyes misted so that he could barely see, yet every blow found its mark, non-stop, until finally the fury inside him began to die down, and only then did he move on to the vaulting horse, a perfect leap that carried him well beyond it, again and again, up onto the trapeze with the strength and agility of a baboon, swinging from there onto the ropes, traversing them so that his biceps bulged and responded to efforts far beyond his normal training sessions. Finally he was still, his breathing barely quicker, and when he had begun, going to his discarded clothing and finding the 38 revolver, both hands were rock steady, the one holding the weapon, the other clasping his gun hand. 6 targets, slivers of kindling wood embedded in the sand, barely a quarter of an inch in width. The shots were almost as rapid as those blows on the punch bag, deafening reports in the soundproofed enclosure, the atmosphere thick with acrid gun smoke. And when Sabat loaded the gun, there were only splinters of smashed wood scattered on the red sand, not a single stick remaining intact. As he returned the 38 to its pocket holster in his jacket, there was a much slower, calmer movement from his limbs, not tiredness, a mixture of relaxation and satisfaction. A man who has walked through hellfire and emerged unscathed. He stepped into the curtained shower, sighed beneath the cold, invigorating spray. His expression too had changed, a sadness that was hidden by the gushing water, and if there were tears, then they were washed away immediately, for even with Sabat, there was a time for crying. Sabat towelled himself dry, took his time dressing, slowly, deliberately he ejected the spent shells from the revolver and reloaded it. His nostrils flared above his black moustache as he controlled his breathing, regulated his anger and hatred towards the Liberation Front, so that once again he was the perfect fighting machine, as deadly, perhaps deadlier, than he had been in his SAS days. For he knew that soon the Führer would send his killers, and Sabat was ready for them. Oh,
so a montage.
This is what we want.
It's a montage, right?
Yeah.
Perfect montage.
It's a training montage. We need a montage. Yeah, it's a training montage. 2 things from that. One is, it's basically, his house is Lara Croft's mansion, but, Sabat style. And the second thing is, right, we've had this brilliant description of what a physical specimen he is. It would be really, really easy to be disappointed in the rest of the book if he doesn't get to use this and demonstrate this. But actually, we've had the montage. We don't have to wait 30 minutes for him to meet the villain. The very next scene, he sets this trap for the Nazis, and after knocking them on their asses after they broke in, he says to them, and I quote, "On your feet, you fucking scum. I'm giving you the chance to fight for your lives." And then we get a 3-page description of him kicking the living shit out of these skinheads in his basement. It's absolutely incredible. It's fucking brilliant.
It's good.
Chapter 6. Everything
Chapter
I wanted
6,
from a Sabat book.
And that montage also has that part that gives us the sense that he actually does have feelings. He has a little cry in the shower.
We're actually getting proper character development for this character now. And, that's what I want. So I want more of this in Sabat 3 and 4, which I now definitely want to read because I think it's just marvellous.
Should this have been the first book?
I think this should totally have been the first book.
Yeah.
And I would definitely say to anybody who wanted to read the Sabat books, if you're curious about the first one and just how out of order it is, then sure, read it. But even without that, this is a miles better book.
Yeah.
This is proper Guy N. Smith on his game. This is so entertaining. Yeah. And it's of its time, but it's perfectly of its time. And Sabat being an oversexed, violent nutjob just makes it all the more entertaining. I mean, there are moments where he perhaps becomes a little bit of a soft touch again because his oversexed nature makes him easy pickings for Lilith and her chosen vessel later on. Because, I mean, the general upshot of the book is the succubus Lilith is manipulating a tin pot wannabe fascist dictator who's amassing an army of poor, dispossessed youths and skinheads and other assorted gammon to do their bidding in order to push Britain to the right and ultimately turn Britain into a fascist state because it suits her perverted purposes. It's so wonderfully 70s and pulpy, but also very now, because there's a scene where the police are confronted by fascist marchers and anti-fascist counter-protesters, but it all turns out to be something of a plot, and it just turns into a pitched battle scene between police and far-right protesters. And, you know, it's great. It's great. And Sabat does use power, and he uses knowledge, and he uses competencies to, by the end, defeat evil. There's a great section in Paris where he astrally projects and learns a bunch of stuff, then uses its triumph over the villains. There's a process to it. Yeah. He uses his knowledge, his skills, his competence. He doesn't completely fuck everything up, and the whole day is saved by somebody who's only had 2 paragraphs in the entire book to that point. And Lilith and the Nazis are defeated. And most importantly, there is 0 sexual violence in the entire book. And even when the prostitutes are being murdered, they're not being raped. There's no sexual violence. They're ritual killings.
Yeah.
He only wanks once but gets interrupted, and the other time he's tempted to have one off the wrist. His willpower allows him to suppress the urge, which is incredible. Character growth, I reckon.
Yeah, a changed man in the second book. But,
yeah. So in conclusion, I thought it was great. I thought it was Guy and Smith on top form, and it's prompted me to want to read the third one.
Yeah, likewise. And after looking at some of the other ones, I think the last one sounds even more bonkers because it's when he's in his 60s and he's holed up in some cottage with someone called GN, who's a reporter, who's also in his 60s. And apparently they're just drinking tea, waiting for something to happen, which sounds great.
Yeah, I think the last 2 were published in something like 2017 and 2019, weren't they? So there was a 28-year gap or something, a 38-year gap even. Yeah. And they were published by Black Hill Books. So, yeah, I definitely want to get my hands on them. I've got the first 4. Yeah. But those other 2 do sound also amusing. And, I mean, the great thing about this is I read this in the castle in Northumbria whilst we were on our jollies. And before it, I'd read... I picked up some... I think Ian Stead gave me an omnibus of Alien novel adaptations from the Dark Horse comics. And whilst we were out there, I just happened to find in a second-hand shop the second omnibus, which had the 2 follow-on novels. Yeah. And the first 2 and the first one of the second, so the first 3 books, the first 3 novels that are in these 2 omnibuses, were the stories that originally, when they were published by Dark Horse Comics, were the continuation of Aliens and had Hicks and Newt in them. And Newt is 10 years older. She's grown up. She's been in a psychiatric institution. But because Alien 3 came out and screwed everything up, when they were reprinted, they changed them to Billy and Wilkes. And there is this really fucking unfortunate thing in these novels where they introduce sexual tension and longing between the Hicks analogue and the Newt analogue, to the point where in the third novel, Wilkes, aka Hicks, has a dream about Billy, aka Newt, that starts off as a memory of when he rescued her and is carrying her as a 10-year-old girl, and then all of a sudden she's her older self, and with one of her, and I quote, small breasts exposed. And the line is, he silenced his mouth with hers. And it's like, what the fuck am I reading? Where they've sexualized Newt and suggested a sexual relationship between Hicks and Newt. Yeah. And it's like, man, who wrote this? Fuck off. You mail online prick. Just take this and stick it up your ass. So the great thing about reading Sabat 2 was it was less problematic than the Aliens spin-off novel that I read before it, which was a real nice switch.
Yeah, nice change of course for your time away.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, of course, our last episode was Slimer, and Loz and I were talking about, like, things like pushing the envelope of the novels that people were writing at the time and all the sexual violence and all that business. I think you listened to the audiobook of Slimer.
I did, yeah.
What did you make of it?
I found it quite entertaining, but I was expecting the fungus to some extent, but it was I found it quite uncomfortable at some point. It was really, and I felt they were really pushing things in it. And the audio version, the guy was putting on accents, which I kind of liked, but kind of annoyed me as well, because it was kind of interfering with the way I would have, sort of interpreted things. But yeah, I can see where they're going with it, in the sense of just really pushing things and just
Yeah. Somebody commented on it on YouTube saying, "You've done 2, now you need to do Carnosaur." So I think they've probably made a fair point. I think if I can get a couple of copies of Carnosaur for a reasonable price, I think next year we need to complete the Harry Adam Knight Grand Slam and do Carnosaur as well.
Yeah, makes sense.
But that's one for 2025 or beyond, I think. But anyway, Graham, thank you for coming back and having some further reflections, and also reading Sabat too, because I think you only finished it about 10 minutes before we started recording.
Literally, yeah. It was 2 minutes before I joined this. I had to rattle through, and but I managed it, which was good.
Yeah, worth it though.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad we did it, actually, because I think I would have felt a little bit sad if we hadn't have done Sabat 2.
Yeah. It feels like it's restored a little bit of faith for me in Guy, and I can put Sabat 1 down as an aberration and get behind Sabat 2, which makes me happier.
Yeah. Of course, we haven't read Bamboo Gorillas yet, so.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, let's get Crime Commandos done before we do that.
Yeah,
let's continue our Peter Cave exploration. All right, cheers,
brilliant.
Graham.
Cheers.
Massive thanks to Phil and Graham for coming back to talk about more Guy and Smith, although I think I do owe Phil something more up her street after this one. And Phil elected not to return for the follow-up discussion, as she had no intention of reading any more Sabat, which is absolutely fair. I'd love to be in a position to say, as we did on the Conan episode recently, that this book, now 42 years old, is a product of its time, and that attitudes that were prevalent then are no longer particularly an issue, but just like the Conan stories we looked at, the questionable content is reflective of attitudes and behaviours that, again, I would love to say have massively changed in the intervening period, but just a passing glance at the news, contemporary politics and some of the ugly presences in modern popular culture indicate that we haven't got nearly as far as we in polite society would like to pretend. We've had some comments on our Halloween episodes. First, Paul Miles on our Slimer episode said, "Hi guys, another great review of a Harry Adam Knight novel. Just Carnosaur to go. Then the Unholy Trinity will be completed." Thanks, Paul. We'll get that on next year's shortlist, I reckon. And on YouTube, Xintract said on the House of the Borderlands episode, "I read this book after listening to the first 20 minutes or so of this, so as to avoid spoilers, and coming back now I absolutely agree with the whole Mary thinks he is crazy angle that was very much my interpretation reading it for the first time in 2024. I actually found the writing, though brief and far between, very believable for someone who is living in isolation with someone who seemingly out of nowhere boards up the house and starts battling with invisible pigmen. Like it really seems like she can't see them, and with their bodies disappearing in daylight, he really does come off as an unreliable narrator. As to what happens after it, it's kind of hard to continue the all in his head thing unless we assume basically the whole end half of the book is just him in his head, which I personally wouldn't go so far as, but can absolutely see it read that way. Great episode as always, and thanks for giving me a new author to read." Well, thanks for that, and that chimes closely with what Andrew Van Ness said on the Patreon page too. He said, "Very much enjoyed this one. When I read the book around 2 years ago, due to the prodding of Appendix N and Andy's several mentions, I came to a similar conclusion about the sister being worried about the recluse's sanity about halfway through the first half of the book. It may be that his instability is related to the loss of his love, and this has allowed the psychic forces or extraplanar invasion of the pigmen to be perceived. I think they are real in a sense, and he isn't just crazy. Almost like another reality is converging with the recluse's own. Really modern stuff for such an old story. I think Andy's spot on with his evaluation of Hodgson's subtlety. Really enjoyed the first part of this story, made for a D&D adventure or a text-based game. Thanks Andrew and Xintract for those thoughts, and I think that middle ground is a very sound, satisfactory reading, maybe indicating that severe trauma in the right liminal space enables a sort of breakdown of the veils between worlds. Yeah, I dig it. And finally, also on The House on the Borderland, Paul McRandall commented, "I'm curious if any of the essays in Voices from the Borderlands have much to say about the Hodgson family's time in Ireland. I read somewhere that their father managed to aggravate the locals so much by attempting to convert them to the Anglican Church that they supposedly destroyed the family's orchard. I'm not sure, though, if any of that is documented or just the sort of tale that sprang up around William Hope Hodgson." Thanks, Paul. I don't recall anything suggestive of that in Voices from the Borderlands, but it's a while since I read it from cover to cover, and I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, but I'll look into it and report back. That's it for Halloween this year then. Coming up, we're leaning back into the Mocockeyana with a couple of things to tie up, including the coming of the Terrorfiles. We'll be heading back to Luimanesh to see how Coram is getting on with his feud with the powers of chaos in The King of the Swords, and for the first time we'll dip our toes into the tales of Von Beck, and that will pretty much get us up to Christmas and the annual birthday episode. So, thanks as always to our patrons for keeping this show on the road. First, those without tier, Anthony Piconti, Tim Cardos, Dave Dempster and Sebastian Weetabix. And our Chaos Engineers, Ed Von Stout, Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Spong, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Ben Hagar, Brandon Mays, Dan Charnley, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Gabriel Laycock, Harvey Faulkner-Aston, Jim Kirkland, Jim Jupp, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Matt Saltz, Nick Hopkinson, Ofer Ziv, Paul McRandall, PJ Cooper, Scott Butler, Simon Perrins, and, new to the Don Blass, but one of our oldest correspondents, Michael Hopwood. Michael is no stranger to the podcast world, and you can hear his thoughts on the Nomad of the Time streams in 3 parts on the Bibliophile Adventures podcast, episodes 14, 16 and 17, over on the Nerdy Legion website. And that's available on all the usual podcatchers too, so check it out. And of course, thanks to our crafty jugaderos, Christian Hundal, Graham Holden, Liam Turner, Loz, Mark Taylor, Matthew Broom, Sean Twist, Toby White and Taylor Lavery, and eternal thanks to our patron demons Alistair Davison, Andy Clark, Andy Darby, David Lee, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Glenn Sawyer, Greg Faulkner, Gwen Barlow, Ian Stead, Imria, Janie Stim, Jason Vogel, Joe Monty, Jonathan Sharp, Lee Gary, Mark Hebden, Marius Latauskas, Miles Reed-Labato, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, Tom Murphy, Tony Malazzo, the OG patron Norman Beresford, and last but never least, Robert McMillan. Right, enough of my blather. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can find me on Mastodon and Blue Sky where I'm Stimbot5000. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. BITR Breakfast in the Ruins Radio is live on Radio Garden or via the web player at breakfastintheruinsradio.blogspot.com. We have our Patreon page too, and there are a few extra odds on sods on there. But for now, take care, stay safe, and we will meet again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.